At this time, I would like to introduce Dr. Kim Stackhouse Lawson. Dr. Kim Stackhouse Lawson is a professor in the Department of Animal Sciences at Colorado State University and director of AgNext. AgNext utilizes a multidisciplinary approach to advance sustainability solutions for animal agriculture. Prior to leading AgNext, Kim was the director of sustainability for JBS USA, where she was responsible for coordinating the company's corporate sustainability program and strategies. Kim also served as executive director, global sustainability at National Cattlemen's Beef Association, where she developed the industry's sustainability program. Please help me in welcoming Dr. Kim Stackhouse Lawson.
All right. Thanks for having me, everyone. It's certainly a pleasure to be here. So we're going to talk a little bit today about sustainability in the animal agriculture space and sort of what we can expect moving forward. I'm also going to introduce you to AgNext, which is a new initiative at CSU. So AgNext sits between the College of Ag and the College of Environmental Science, the College of Vet Medicine and Biomedical Sciences, and it's a new initiative at CSU. It's actually a provost initiative, and we've been focused the first year really on developing who we want to be from a vision and mission standpoint. So a few things that are stand apart when you compare AgNext to other sustainability initiatives. The first is that all we focused on is animal agriculture, and we believe that it is an important and sustainable part of our global food system. And the second unique thing is that we are a group that's really focused forward. So historically, in the space of sustainability, most work has looked backwards in time. So how have we adjusted practices in the last 30 years, and how has that shifted outcomes? And what we heard from our stakeholders is that we needed a group that was focused forward. We needed a group that was really excited about innovation. And so we've developed a mission statement that really tries to capture that, to identify and scale innovation that fosters the health of animals and ecosystems, to promote profitable industries that support vibrant communities. So another obvious thing is an explicit call out to profitability, because in this space of sustainability, economic sustainability is often referenced, but it's referenced in more of a steady state or a maintenance of economic sustainability. And what we heard from our stakeholders was we want to be profitable. We want to do all of these other really important things from a sustainability standpoint too, but we need to define economic sustainability more explicitly as profitability. So the most exciting thing about AgNext is the incredible support that we have from our industry partners. And so we developed what we call our Industry Innovation Working Group. And this is a group of 12 individuals who have absolutely just spent countless hours with us during our startup phase, but have also continued to just really provide unique perspective to our group. And so what we're trying to do is to develop a team at CSU who has constant feedback and direct communication with industry partners. And you can see industry partners on this particular slide all the way to the financial community, to the retail, so to the end user space, and eventually we'll include other stakeholders. Each of these individuals has a 3-year term, so we actually added a new 4 to this group most recently in the fall, but they commit countless hours to us and have really helped to shape who AgNext is. So the CSU commitment, because that always becomes the question, is sort of what is CSU committing, and how is this initiative going to become a reality? So CSU has committed $4.5 million in startup salaries and startup budgets to add 12 people to the team in a cluster hire fashion. So these individuals, all 12 of them, will be half funded by AgNext through the provost, and then half funded through a partnering department, okay? So the intent for this cluster hire is to really extend across the university, but to bring together 12 people, 13 if you count myself, who are focused on developing sustainable solutions for animal agriculture. So this will be the largest initiative of its kind in the country, and I would say arguably the world. And you can sort of, as you look at the list of people that will eventually join our team, really start to appreciate the vast definition that CSU is using to define sustainability in animal agriculture, and hopefully address some pretty significant gaps that exist both in Colorado, but in the animal agriculture industry more broadly. So we're really excited about these team members. Currently, we just actually completed the livestock economist search, so we'll have a new livestock economist coming to the team. That individual, Dr. DeLay, will start in August, and we are in the middle of the dairy sustainability system search and the feed yard sustainability system search as well. We expect to have those completed the hire made by August 1st, hopefully earlier, and have those people here as soon as possible. So really excited about the team that we will be building at CSU. So with that, we're going to go ahead and switch gears and talk a little bit about sustainability. So this sustainability space is hard because it's one of the really wicked problems that we deal with in animal agriculture and in agriculture more broadly, and frankly, from a societal perspective, where science and emotion are on equal footing, right? And if you ever have a question about what wins, it's not science, right? And yet we're answering a lot of these wicked problems with science. And yet in this space, there's just such an incredible emotional element to the work. And then you compound that with how difficult it is to influence people today, right? And how skeptic we all are. It's not just this young person on this slide with the access to social media, right? We've all become, I think, a bit skeptic of information, and also probably a little bit nervous about what we believe or what we read, right? So we live in a really polarizing space. And in sustainability, we face this day in and day out. So when we talk about the definition of sustainability, people get really frustrated because it doesn't just have a single definition, right? I mean, historically, we've defined it using 3 critical pillars of economic, environmental, and social sustainability. But when you start kind of digging into what that means, right, everything starts to be encompassed. And so I've listed up here on this slide a few metrics that people might use to define these buckets. So go ahead and take a look at those and then think about if they're relevant to you, right? And this exercise is not to say that I put the wrong or the right metrics on the slide, right? It's to really sort of bring out that we just in our own sort of selves are going to define economic, social, and environmental sustainability differently because of who we are, but also potentially for the companies that we work with or the supply chain sector that we might represent. And then when we start looking at the overlap, right, the socioeconomic, the eco-environmental, and the social environmental aspects of these, right, it's within those nexus that our systems really function. And that adds such an incredible level of complexity to this particular topic. So why has this become such a challenging issue? Well, it's because people care, right? Society cares as a whole. I think if you guys look kind of deep inside yourselves, so there's probably all of you would say, yeah, I care about this, right? And I may not like the word sustainability, but these things are important to me. They're important to my family. They're important to my business. They're important to my way of life. And a lot of society feels like this. And today they're asking questions to understand how they might be able to influence these aspects of sustainability or look for opportunities or progress in that space. So I am a huge believer of sustainability really being holistic. And I actually like the multifaceted aspect of sustainability. But today, and because I only have 40 minutes with you all, we're going to shift gears and talk about climate change, because this is the topic that right now is driving the most conversation in the sustainability space. And what I will tell you is that I've been doing this now for a little bit over 15 years, so right when it started, and it really started as a climate change issue. That's what my Ph.D. is in. That's what most of my research was in. And we saw this really shift, especially in the animal agriculture space, where we really shifted not ever away from climate, but into other aspects of sustainability that really help shape really robust sustainability programs. And now we are absolutely coming kind of back around to climate change really dominating the conversation. So let's talk about climate change for a minute. So in the last year and a half, there's been an incredible commitments made by some major companies in the aspect of net zero. And I actually haven't updated this slide in over a year. And if I did, the logos that would have made net zero commitments would wrap around this room. But it's a really unique opportunity to kind of focus in on some of these companies that have made these big public commitments, and to talk about some of the things that have even changed since they made them. So those companies that are relevant to animal agriculture are on top of the line. And you'll see some really big companies, right? Big companies that influence your business, that, you know, they may be business partners of yours, but they certainly influence our lives, right? Our daily lives, where we get our food products from our family. And then if you look towards the bottom part of that slide, right under here, some more general companies, and look at those major companies that have made net zero commitments, and think about just for a minute how they might achieve those, right? So the one that's most interesting to me is BP, right? So making a net zero commitment and kind of what that means, and what that might mean to their business operations, or their way that they're going to do business, or their shareholders, or their stakeholders, right? So the other thing that I want to bring up is in this slide, when I built it just a little over a year ago, I built it May of last year. There was a difference between net zero and carbon neutral and climate neutral, right? So companies were actually coming out and they're saying, we're net zero, but we're only going to be carbon neutral. Or we're net zero, but we're going to be climate neutral. So there was actually, at the time, a definition needed for net zero. Today, all of those companies have pivoted to climate neutral commitments. Carbon neutral would just be focusing on greenhouse gases that are carbon derived. Climate neutral would be all greenhouse gases, to include other greenhouse gases outside of carbon, so inclusive of nitrous oxide, for example. And the reason we saw that shift is actually greenwashing backlash, okay, on net zero commitments that were not holistic enough. And for those of you who follow big companies, we actually saw a few of these big companies take that commitment that they had made and re-announce it, okay? So we've never seen a public commitment be made like this, and then they changed it in the public sphere. And so that kind of movement in the corporate space is just a really interesting aspect to watch, and is really driving a lot of the climate change conversation today. So it's really important that we understand the greenhouse gases that go into one of these commitments, okay? So how would you not only get to net zero, but how do you even understand what your impact is today? So in the corporate space, and I want all of you to understand that this is different, okay? The corporates approach climate change reporting different than academia, and they report it, and that is different than regulatory, and regulatory is then different than carbon markets, and carbon markets, it's all different, okay? So the take-home message here is it's absolutely the wild, wild west. We're gonna talk about it like a corporation because we just talked about those net zero those net zero commitments. So in the corporate space, you talk about and report emissions as scopes, okay? Scope 1, Scope 2s, and Scope 3. So I'm going to put on my JBS hat for a minute because I know you're all familiar with those facilities, and it's a really easy way to talk about these emissions. So when I was working for JBS, a Scope 1 emission were our greenhouse gas emissions from that operation, okay? So from my plants. right? So it was Greeley beef. And it was the emissions that were coming from that facility, whether it's wastewater treatment, it could be the fossil fuel emissions, right, that were burnings from combustible engines, it could be the refrigeration, the hydrofluorocarbons, right, that we have in refrigeration units that are working on keeping those plants running. Scope 2 emissions are those emissions that come from the energy use source. Okay, so in the JBS system, for example, my Scope 2 emissions in the Greeley plant are different than in the Cactus, Texas plant, because believe it or not, the Cactus, Texas plant sources a greater amount of renewable energy from the municipality than the Greeley energy grid is, okay, in Colorado. So we're more predominantly coal in Greeley, Colorado, than we are in, as a country, than we are in Cactus, Texas. Okay, so my ability as the head of sustainability at JBS to control my Scope 2 emissions, right, is relatively limited. I could push the company to try to buy more renewable energy from other sources, right, which causes then some considerable challenges in the local community, right, when you start shifting big energy users or big water users away from city municipality, that can cause some challenges from an economic standpoint. Or I can work on the plant to reduce emissions, right? So if we reduce Scope 1, we're gonna have a little bit less of a footprint in Scope 2. Scope 3 is everything I need in that beef plant to turn out a steak or a big primal, right? Because those beef plants don't turn out steak. So it's the beef, it's the corn that animal was fed, it's the fertilizer that landed on that corn crop, it's the packaging material, it is the mileage that my team members drive to that plant every day, it's the food that you throw out, inclusive of the fat and the bone, that go to the landfill, okay? It's the fact that we can't recycle plastics in this country that have touched blood. Okay, the Scope 3 emissions are seemingly insurmountable, yet, when a company commits to net zero, it includes Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3, and there is not one company today who has a plan on how to achieve that net zero commitment. Not one. Okay, Smithfield's close. Actually, I would say, like, arguably, Smithfield's probably done the best job in terms of the food companies that have gotten plans pretty close together. Now, this is further complicated with the way in which these companies have to report. Okay, and it is not, having been in this particular position, it is, they would rather not, okay, report to all of these different standard bodies, but it is absolutely the wild, wild west in the corporate space as to what standard you're going to report to. So I've listed the 5 most common: the Global Reporting Initiative, the Carbon Disclosure Program, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Boards, and the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. But there are over, I would say arguably, 500 or 600 different standards that corporations are reporting to, which again, different than regulatory, different than academia, different than industry, different than carbon markets. No one is doing the same thing, okay? So it makes it really messy. Okay, so let's dig down into why Scope 3 causes so much challenges. So this is a great slide that Rabobank put together, and it shows some big brands on the bottom, hopefully some big brands that you're all really familiar with. And I always focus on Starbucks. I think it's because when I'm up giving a talk, it'd be so nice to have, you know, a nice latte or something. But let's focus on Starbucks here. So Starbucks, what I'm showing you here in the dark green are Scope 3 emissions for the Starbucks brand, okay? And in the orange are their Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions, okay? So that would be their operations and then the energy that's supplying those operations. So let's talk about this 96% for a moment, and I need audience participation here. So what's going in to that? So there's the coffee bean, right? And all of the practices that it takes to grow a coffee bean. What else do we know Starbucks is a big consumer of? What's that? Cups. Yeah. Yep. Milk. Yep. And on the, so we've got the cow, we've got enteric emissions now, we've got feed, right? We've got manure, we've got all kinds of things. But the cup is a really interesting one. How many of you recycle your Starbucks cups? Yeah, I don't either. Ooh, one person. This is the first time I've ever had one person in a talk. So good job. Great job. I don't either. For everyone else, don't feel too guilty. But did you know that they're actually recyclable? And unless we start recycling our Starbucks cup, they're never going to meet their commitment? Which, I mean, is, arguably, are they ever going to meet their commitment anyway? Probably not. But the point is, right, when you really start to think about what goes into these Scope 3 emissions, and more importantly, how much of the footprint they take up, meeting these net zero goals becomes seemingly impossible. So the industry has taken pretty aggressive approaches in this space of sustainability, especially related to net zero. So NCBA has made a goal to be climate neutral by 2040. You'll notice a number of other really good sustainability commitments here, which I think are phenomenal. We just don't have time to kind of talk about the robustness of all of these commitments. The U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef recently came out with their net zero goal, which is to achieve climate neutrality by 2040 as well. This is a group that I will give some significant props to. They waited to announce their goals until just April of this year. And they actually came out with a semblance of a roadmap. I'm not sure we can give them full credit for a roadmap, but it is the closest I have ever seen a group actually setting out targets and then following it with at least some action items, right, for people to start working towards all of their goals. Again, another great job done here, looking at not just climate, but all of those sustainability aspects and making a pretty robust program to be really focused on holistic sustainability. The Innovation Center for U.S. Dairy has a net zero goal as well to achieve greenhouse gas neutrality. They call this their net zero initiative. It's a very aggressive program. Again, another group who's done a really good job, not just focused on climate, but more holistic sustainability programming. So the other thing you need to understand in this climate space is last fall, I think it was September or November, the International Panel on Climate Change released their new AR6 report. So the International Panel on Climate Change is a group of scientists, atmospheric scientists and chemists, who come together to really try to understand the impact that man is having on climate change. And it's really, I'll tell this quick story. When I was in graduate school, I was getting my Ph.D. in animal science. Davis has an animal biology program, but nonetheless, animal science. And I was taking atmospheric chemistry classes because I studied and still do study greenhouse gas emissions from cattle. And I remember sitting in that class, and it was at the time the first AR6 or the first AR report came out. And I remember in Davis, with a bunch of atmospheric chemists sitting in class, and our professor who would describe the carbon cycle and why we thought releasing CO2 in the atmosphere was not great, and all of the other challenges that could come from that. That when the report came out, it was still unclear. Right? And his message to us was, well, we still don't know the effect that man is having on climate change. We can assume that by burning carbon and releasing it into the atmosphere where we could see these things, but we still don't actually know. So fast forward 15, 16, 17, however old I am now, years later, and this AR6 report comes out, and this is the most aggressive report we've ever seen the International Panel on Climate Change released. And it really got the attention of a lot of policymakers and a lot of scientists. And what this group says is they say that near 1.5 to 2 degrees C warming is unavoidable. And many of the climate impacts we're seeing today are irreversible. And notably, and remember when we talked about kind of the political nature of sustainability and that science and emotion are oftentimes competing, the IPCC came out and said the net zero goals actually misinterpret what we need to do to stop climate change. And what we need to do to stop climate change is to stop emitting CO2. So we need to stop burning fossil fuels and releasing them into the atmosphere. Now, we all drove here today, make no mistake. Right? So when you start to think about the infrastructure needs, right, of stopping all fossil fuel to be released into the atmosphere from a burning perspective, right, it's another seemingly insurmountable challenge. And yet that's really what we need to do, what this report suggests we need to do to limit these effects. The other interesting thing that the IPCC says is that methane reductions are not as important as CO2 reductions, so fossil fuel emissions from fossil fuels. And the reason that they say that is that when we burn fossil fuels, we also release a sulfite aerosol, okay? So we burn the fossil fuel, we release the CO2. A sulfite aerosol is released also, and that sulfite aerosol has actually an ability to cool the planet, okay? So it's a cooling molecule. And so it cools the planet, CO2 warms the planet. So the only reason to focus on methane reduction for the IPCC is to basically account for the cooling, okay, that those sulfite aerosols have, right? And so, yes, methane's important, but it has to coincide, right, with that reduction that we see in sulfite aerosols. It's really just going to make up for those. So the other thing that's happening in the political space is the real aggressive nature that our current administration has on climate change. And the Biden-Harris administration calls climate change an issue of national security, and they've committed the U.S. to a net zero economy by 2050. And they have some great programs that they've launched to try to get this accomplished. The other thing that they've done is at the COP26 meeting, in partnership with the EU and a number of other countries, I think 107 or something, they announced a commitment to reduce methane emissions below 2020 levels by 2030. Now notice that that's a little bit different, right, than what the IPCC is recommending that we do. And yet their perspective here, so the scientific aspect of focusing on methane is the infrastructure is so far behind from limiting our CO2 emissions, that if we can reduce methane, it will buy us time to catch up on infrastructure to reduce the emissions from fossil fuel burning. Okay, so that's the play that's the scientific play that the administration is making. And so through this announcement, USDA came forward and they said, okay, we're gonna meet this by prioritizing the following. And you can see a long list of bullets that they're going to do, and they have already started doing. But what I want you guys to understand is the actual emissions by source that we see from methane that are man-made in this country. And this is EPA data here. So this big green bucket here is agriculture. And of agriculture, enteric methane, manure management, and rice cultivation make up all of our methane emissions. And enteric emissions represent 30% of the man-made methane budget in the US. And that is greater than all of oil and gas, okay? I've studied this my entire life. I'm going to talk to you about how hard it is to reduce. But I just think it's really important that we know that the contribution is such coming from agriculture and specifically coming from animal agriculture. And the administration is not saying that they will push any regulation, but I think we need to be very mindful of this particular graph and just understand where these emissions are sourced from. So the other thing that's really an incredible pressure in the sustainability space, and this is climate and other issues, is how the financial markets have evolved in this space. And this was actually my job at JBS. I really love this stuff, so you could always hear my energy kind of perk up at this part of the talk. But the first green bond was actually launched in 2007. And since then, there's been the advent of green bonds, social bonds, sustainability-linked bonds, green loans, and sustainability-linked loans, okay? So if it has green in front of it, it means it's environmental. If it says sustainability or social, it usually has all three pillars of sustainability that it's hitting. And usually in the sustainability bonds, they'll be really heavy social. So they'll be really heavy on people programs or animal programs, animal welfare programs, some of those kind of things. But what I want you guys to note here is the absolute explosion that we saw in the middle of a global pandemic in the financial market focused on sustainability and climate. So these are loans or bonds that have lower interest rates, okay, to focus on these kinds of projects, or they may have different ROIs, right, different payback returns. So lots of incentives for companies to do this kind of work in the financial space. The other thing that has happened is that the ESG space has absolutely exploded. So ESG is environmental, social, and governance. And how a company, so this predominantly affects publicly traded companies, okay? And how you get kind of an ESG, you're open to be invested from by hedge funds and other capital to be considered ESG is to report against one of those standards, okay, that we talked about earlier, okay, whether it's SASB is a really common one in the ESG space, for example. And this has really exploded in the last 4 to 5 years, and today represents $41 trillion. Okay, are managed under these kinds of assets. And there was huge explosions since 2018 to 21, but they're expecting that to continue to increase into 2025 by 70%. And today, this represents 1 in every 3 of our dollars. Okay, so think about the 401ks you guys have invested, or Roths, or other kind of big type investment hedge funds. We're all in it. Right? Whether we think we are or whether we're choosing to be or not, because 1 in every $3 is. So this is driving an incredible amount of energy and attention in the sustainability space. So the other thing that happened in March is that the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC, set out a proposal, and it's under a 60-day comment period, which I believe has ended. And basically, the SEC's proposal, their first goal, I think this is really interesting, is to standardize climate impact reporting. And then I actually left the words in from the report that they used, because I think it's really telling of the variable alphabet soup of existing frameworks, right? And then you'll see some of the GRI, SASB, CDP, they're talking about WEF, IBC, et cetera. And so they're trying to standardize that, number one, to make a more fair playing field, okay, for investors. And then they're saying that they're going to require all publicly traded companies to provide annual progress and updates on their climate commitments. Reporting Scope 1 and Scope 2 would be table stakes, and Scope 3 emissions reporting is mandatory only if the output of those greenhouse gases is material or significant to investors, or if companies outline specific targets for them. So think back to that original who's made the net zero commitment slide, and then to our Scope 3 slide, right, where we talked a little bit about Starbucks. Guess what? All those companies and a whole bunch more are going to be reporting their Scope 3 emissions. So this could absolutely change overnight what's happening related to expectations of suppliers, right, within the value chain to report your greenhouse gas emissions, especially if product is going to publicly traded companies. So it's interesting. A year ago, we would have talked a lot more about the consumer. Today, they're unfortunately a little bit boring in the sustainability space. Doesn't mean they don't care. They do care. 75% of millennials believe their investments can influence climate change, and they're also a group of people who really want to do good with their money, right? And that's a good statistic there to say that 84% of millennials believe their investments can lift people out of poverty. And this is some Credit Suisse data that we're showing here. Okay, so with that, I do actually want to talk to you just a tiny bit about the science. So when we think about greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, it's really important to know where our emissions come from and what makes up our emission profile, okay? And the reason that it's important to know the gases that make up our emission profile is because every gas has a different ability to warm the planet, all right? So in the United States, carbon dioxide represents 80% of the greenhouse gas, the man-made greenhouse gases in our country. Methane is 10%, nitrous oxide is 7%, and the fluorinated gases, this is what we use in refrigeration, et cetera, are 3%. Now, carbon dioxide has the least ability to trap heat in the environment, and it's a global warming potential of 1. Methane is 28 times better at trapping heat than 1 molecule of CO2. And nitrous oxide is 310 times better at trapping heat than 1 molecule of CO2. Okay, in animal agriculture, in the plants and manufacturing facilities, we're worried about all of these. On the farm, we're worried about CO2, methane, and nitrous oxide, okay? So if you go back to the sources of greenhouse gas emissions. This is really important in the United States. Transportation makes up 29%. The electricity we produce makes up 25%. Industry is 23%. Where we live and work is 13%. And agriculture is 10%. Now, we'll oftentimes see reports, right, where animal agriculture has a higher percentage of overall contribution, or agriculture has an overall higher percentage of overall contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. Those are oftentimes global numbers, okay? So when you guys see those types of reports that come out, make sure you're checking where's the data coming from and how are the percentages different. Because in the developing world, where they may not have as robust of industry, transportation, and electricity, right? We'll see animal agriculture hold a bigger percentage, okay, of those contributions. So just make sure you're looking at that when you're seeing this type of data. So let's dig deep and look into what greenhouse gas emissions have done from agriculture since the 1990s. So from 1990 to 2019, we've seen increases in greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. We've seen crop cultivation increase by 8.5%, livestock increase by almost 21%, and fuel combustion is the only thing that's gone down, and that's gone down by almost 9%. And this makes sense, guys, okay? We're making more food than we were in 1990. There's going to be more of an impact, right? And our engines are more efficient today. Pivots, tractors, trucks, yeah, you betcha. We're actually seeing those combustion emissions go the other way. Now, what this slide doesn't show is how efficient we've gotten. Okay, so the actual footprint of greenhouse gas divided by food. Now, if we looked at the footprint of greenhouse gas divided by food, right, we know the trend would go down. We're producing more with less, 100%. But we're still seeing those absolute emissions go up, right? So when we think about commitments like reduce methane by X by Y year, right, we're looking at these absolute emissions. So it's really important that we're watching these numbers. So remember, too, we just had a little lesson on atmospheric chemistry, how these molecules interact in the environment. So what's happening, right, with how these gases are increasing and how much they're going up, that profile changes not just our contribution to the total greenhouse gas emissions, but how our contributions are actually changing the temperature or potentially changing the temperature of the planet, right? So we've got to kind of watch all aspects of this. Livestock is responsible for 3.8% of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. Those are our Scope 1 emissions, okay? Not Scope 2 or Scope 3, just our Scope 1. But it's a relatively small contribution when you think about that, the big piece of the pie. Doesn't change the fact we should be working on reducing it. So let's talk for a little bit about the global methane budget. And I know Dr. Mittlohner talked to you last year about this too. So it's really nice to speak to an audience that's thought a little bit about methane and thought a little bit about GWP star. So methane is produced naturally, right, from natural sources and also man-made sources. So it comes from fossil fuel production and use, so oil and gas and agriculture and waste. It comes from biomass burning. It also comes from natural sources like wetlands and geological lakes, termites, like all kinds of things produce methane. It's really cool. The atmosphere also takes up methane, right? So methane's a short-lived climate pollutant. The next slide will describe how that works. But it oxidizes very quickly in the atmosphere. It lives there for about 12 years, right? So it traps that heat for 12 years. And then it oxidizes to CO2 and a number of other things, and that CO2 that it oxidizes to is part of this larger carbon budget, right? And so there's total sinks that are derived with methane. So methane's kind of a cool one because it's one of the naturally occurring greenhouse gases. So nitrous oxide is too. It doesn't oxidize quite the same way, but it is cool. So what we need to worry about here is this difference. Okay, the difference between what we're emitting and what the land or what the land mass can take back down in a sink. So what does that mean in the animal life cycle, right? Because that's what we're worried about. And enteric methane emissions are really our biggest lever in animal agriculture for this exact reason. So we know animals belch methane, right, from their rumen. And they actually respire it, which is kind of cool. But nonetheless, it's coming out of the mouth. And when that methane comes out of the mouth, it oxidizes, okay, to water and CO2. And that CO2 goes back to the plant that then the cow eats. So she in her little self is kind of a pretty cool little carbon cycle, right? And so there's this notion, and this was developed by Oxford, that we have been inaccurately evaluating the impact of one molecule, a biological methane molecule, on temperature change. And so that's what GWP star is, okay? So it's a really interesting way to look at the math behind how methane is changing temperature. And this is some work that Frank Mitloner did and published last year, and I think it's a really interesting case study. So if you'll just bear with me, this will give you a kind of it's a real quick way to understand GWP star. So this is taking the California dairy cow population. And we know that population has increased, right, from, about 1970, 75, 1980 to a huge increase in number of cows to 2010 and 2015. That dotted line is just milk production. So if you look at what that means, so that cow herd and their impact on global temperature, okay, that's what we're actually looking at here. GWP, so kind of the old way to measure methane's impact on climate change, is in the gray. And the new way, GWP star, is that dark black. Okay, so what's really interesting is as the cow herd grows, we see the impact of methane on global temperature change actually greater than the old way we used to measure it. Okay, but as soon as Frank would never promote actually decreasing the cow herd. It's just a really easy way to show a decrease of methane, okay? Fewer cows, less methane, so straightforward case study. As he modeled a 1% decrease in the herd, what you're gonna see here is an immediate drop of the impact of methane on global temperature change. And using GWP 100, the old way to measure it, we see that gas essentially is modeled to stay in the atmosphere, okay? So it's not responding to that 12-year lifespan that the gas lives. So that's some really new and interesting new approach. We haven't seen this adopted yet by very many. There's quite a few of us in academia that are playing with this and trying to understand models that can help us do a better job. But it's something that is going to be really important moving forward so that we can really understand how methane is impacting changing climate. And then also, if you look at like small decreases, right, in methane can have a really big impact on our effect on global temperature. So some other things I wanted to talk to you guys about is beef. And beef is a little bit different because people assume that impact is coming from different sectors of the beef value chain. So one of the reasons I love the beef industry so much is the complexity. And our field of study, greenhouse gas emissions, is really highlighted. And if you focus on this top graph, which is all we have time to talk about today, and you look at the cow-calf, stalker, and finishing phases, what you'll see here is the majority of methane, almost 75%, of methane, is coming from the ranch, okay? So why? Well, she's a cow, and we know as they graze larger, longer, right, change forages, those microbes are gonna have to work harder. She's gonna produce more methane. She's also got her daughters right there, right, with her, and bulls with her. So it's a bit of a factory type scenario, okay? So it's a significant amount of the footprint, and the cattle feeder represents a little under 10%. Okay, and the stalkers are in there in the middle. And that's oftentimes counterintuitive of what we would think the impact would be from a beef system. And it's really counterintuitive of where the research has been conducted. And it's also counterintuitive of where the pressure is today. So remember, science and emotion, and yet all the pressure I talked about, financial, regulatory, it's gonna happen in these confined systems first. Okay, so it makes our job of figuring out where to start even harder, right? Especially as scientists, as funding agencies, as industry, as regulatory bodies, right? That extra element of perception and emotion makes our job very difficult. So if we look at the breakdown of what this footprint is in the beef space, over 65%, 65-ish% is enteric methane. Okay, the next most common greenhouse gas emission, or the one that's really controlling that footprint, is land nitrous oxide. So that's urine and feces mixing, okay? And then the urease enzyme in the urine oxidizes, and nitrous oxide is produced. Notice, too, that nitrous oxide is predominantly produced in the cow-calf sector. Okay, we do less manure management there, clearly. I mean, we don't know what we're gonna do on a ranch, right? So there's some limitations into how we're gonna be able to mitigate this, but oftentimes we think immediately of that feed yard because of the way that they're housed, and yet scientifically that's not what we see. So what do we know, right? So how do we know methane's an incredible lever that we can pull. Scientists have been looking at methane for, believe it or not, over 100 years because it's also a loss of energy for the animal. And despite our long history of really looking into it, there hasn't been a ton of funding in this space either. I would say the funding has been, it's just been very, very low, especially since about 2010. But we really have not developed anything that we know works and works in a repeatable fashion over and over again and doesn't cost the producer an arm and a leg to feed. Right? So I get this phone call, I think, every day. Hey, Kim, I want to start down the sustainability path. I want to get on the journey. I'm really excited about it. I want to do this. What do I do? Keep doing what you're doing, right? So we kind of go back to these efficiency metrics that we know, right? Reproduction efficiency matters. Time on feed matters. Death loss matters. Those things matter the most. And right now, I don't have a real solution for you in the enteric methane space, and neither does anybody else. Okay, we've got some stuff coming. So this is some work that Sarah Place and Frank Mitloner did, talking about, okay, everybody's made these net zero commitments. Is it really possible? So they modeled this with GWP star. This is dairy and beef in the United States. And I just want you guys to pay attention to a few things on the if it's possible. The first thing is we need a stable herd. That's hard for a lot of producers to hear, right? That means we can't grow. That kind of goes against that profitability, right, aspect. So we need a stable herd. We also need a reduction in manure methane of 0.4 to 1.5% a year. We need a reduction in enteric methane of 0.3 to 1% a year. That's a lot of years. I don't know if you guys are looking at the y-axis. It's a lot of years. Like 1% adds up. We need a 0.75 to a 2% reduction in indirect emissions. So those would be scope 2 emissions a year. So when I start looking at this and I'm thinking to myself, like, okay, they picked 2010 as a baseline. It's 100. These two scientists are phenomenal. I think they did a great job. But we have to start asking those kind of questions. Is 2010 a fair baseline? What is a fair baseline? What's a meaningful baseline to us? And then this is, of course, just based on net zero warming, not absolute greenhouse gas emissions. So this may or may not meet the needs of the Biden administration to reduce methane emissions, right? Because these guys are focused on the change of the impact the molecule is having on temperature rather than the total emission production. So the other thing that's really important is feed in animal agriculture systems, and we probably don't do enough time, we don't spend enough time talking about the impact that feed has in those big scope 3 type reporting. So it's really important from a nitrous oxide perspective. It's also really important from a CO2 perspective and opportunities to keep more carbon in the soil. So we work a lot with the soil and crops team on understanding no-till applications, appropriate fertilizer application, and some of these things work well in some regions and not in another. Cover cropping is, perfect example of that. We've got a tough time in northern Colorado with our lack of water in the cover cropping space. And then there's a lot of work right now looking at livestock integration into cropping systems. And it's really interesting. When I came to CSU, the soil and crops team was the first team I worked with because we have some of the best soil scientists in the country working in carbon sequestration. They're phenomenal, and they're not livestock people, right? They're crop people, and they were saying, it's really exciting to see more grazing integrated into our cropping systems, and it kind of took me aback because the way they were talking about it was that it felt new to them, and so I sort of said, well, we've been doing this in animal agriculture for a really long time, and there's whole systems, right, like Oklahoma winter wheat grazing and stuff that are founded on this. And what's new and exciting about this is that team is actually developing the capacity to measure the carbon flux faster. So it took us 10 years to measure soil carbon changes. That's what it takes now. They're working on methodology to see if we can't measure the change in 3 years. Okay, so that's what we're starting to talk about in terms of kind of this integration and understanding why when we rotate livestock into cropping systems, we see more soil organic matter develop. So in this space changes right now. Every week is something new, I feel like, and the potential carbon market is the most exciting thing at the moment that is happening in the climate/sustainability space. And it's really a challenging space because it like the corporate sustainability programs is absolutely the wild, wild west, right? And it's really hard to understand how these markets are going to develop and how are they going to develop with low transaction costs to make that carbon value, right, the actual amount somebody's paying for carbon, translate through all of the channels that are required today to validate that carbon and do a variety of different things to the producer to actually implement the practice, right? So it's very wide right now in the space of beef. It's a little bit closer, of course, with some of our digester technology and whatnot in the dairy space, but some really interesting challenges here. The other thing I want you guys to understand is this notion between inset and offset markets. And I think this is going to be especially important for our enteric carbon accounting, okay? So an inset market means that the carbon would stay in a supply chain, okay? So if, and JBS does have a net zero commitment, right? They have to offset their emissions within their supply chain, scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, and an inset carbon would mean they would buy the carbon within their supply chain. So they would get immediate credit for it, okay? An offset market is like BP offsetting their greenhouse gas emissions with soil sequestration, right? So it's interesting, and I think it's something we need to be very careful of. If you sell a carbon market out of the beef or dairy industries, we don't get to count it as a reduction. And neither does your customer, right, from a food company standpoint. So my argument would be, I think eventually, I don't know, we'll see. I might be wrong on this too. I've been wrong on a lot of things. But that inset carbon might actually be worth more than offset carbon, right? When you think about being within a supply chain. So just something to keep in mind, something to watch. I think it could be really exciting. I actually think this administration is pretty serious about these carbon markets and potentially kind of working through them from a policy perspective too. So lots of opportunities here. We need to help co-develop them. It doesn't really matter if I'm there. I'm just the scientist to help track it. But I really think it's important that our industry partners are there to help co-develop these markets. Okay, so this is something we don't talk enough about in the climate space, and it's something that I'm really passionate about, and we have an incredible team in northern Colorado that works on this. So not only do livestock provide us incredible food from livestock or from land that can't otherwise be used for food production, but those rangelands store 20% of the globe's soil organic carbon, and that's work that was done by Rich Conant at CSU, and that's incredible, right? That they produce food, and because they're grazing and because they're keeping those grazing lands intact, that soil organic carbon stays in the soil, right? So that's an incredible thing. I always get a question, why can't we take credit for that? And the reason is the models that we use and EPA uses and others use to track carbon reporting are ISO verified and standardized and and they don't include this soil organic carbon maintenance, okay? So it is something we need to keep talking about. It's really, really important. We've got to figure out how to talk about these benefits and to really quantify them and to help make sure that soil carbon stays where it belongs. So, excuse me. In this space, there are some things that we can encourage producers to do. The first is to preserve rangelands and to avoid conversion. The second is to restore cultivated and degraded lands back into rangelands. And then the third thing we have to do is practice livestock adaptive management. So can't overgraze, right? When we overgraze, we know we see carbon flux. So as we're experiencing periods of drought, right, that just adds additional influence into how important those drought management plans are, get those cattle off of that landscape and to really let that soil carbon stay where it's at. Okay, so we're gonna round out this with just, I think there's just 3 more slides. But pressure to take action for our producer partners and our supply chain is coming from every angle, right? And it's not clear. Like these arrows up here are straight. but I mean, this is not a clear space. Consumers, and sorry, I have consumers listed twice, and NGOs, consumers, customers, I'm pretty sure I meant to put there, and NGOs, regulatory pending potential regulatory implications, banks and investors, carbon markets, right? All of this is unclear. We don't know what direction to move. I don't have great advice to give, right? It's very speculatory at the moment. What I can tell you is that I think climate's going to be a focus, certainly for the next 4 years, and likely for the next 8 or 9. We've got to get these greenhouse gas emissions under control, according to those atmospheric scientists. I think social equity for corporations is going to be comparable, right? So we're going to see a real focus on social equity and reporting social equity. There's not a lot we know, right, about how to report this and report it well to really begin to drive change, but I think we'll see corporations focus on that. It's important to remember total methane emissions and greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture are increasing. And that impact is measured and reported differently. And they're not comparable. Okay, there's enough differences between the different reporting strategies that it is not comparing apples and apples. So we need to be very cognizant of that. We are behind in the research. That's like the understatement of the century. I actually met with a company this morning, and we were talking about the fact that we've never even stacked technologies. So, we've never even tried. This is a particular project where we're looking at grazing animals and measuring greenhouse gas emissions, and we've never even stacked an implant with a feed additive to understand how it reduces methane. So, I mean, we are... This is what keeps me up at night. We're really behind in research, and funding is just, it's starting to come, but it's really slow, and there's not a lot of it, right? So it's just lacking in that space. And corporate programs have significant supply chain expectations, but we don't have a lot of clarity around what those expectations are going to be. So I always get asked, what's the next 5 years look like? And I don't know. I've been working in this space for over 15 years, and I have never seen the space move faster than it is moving right now. Weeks matter. Every week is something new. And there's absolutely no clear path, right? It's just so much information. Usually I get that response too, gosh, this was a lot of information. But we know that the train is moving. So if I was pushed a couple weeks ago to actually put no, we want you to put something down on the slide. So I thought, well, I put the thought in, I might as well repeat it here. So what do I see in 1 to 2 years? It might actually be sooner than that. Even in the 2 weeks I built this is ramped up with a lot of the focus on the SEC. I think we will be reporting carbon footprinting. Certainly the big companies will be, big producers will be. You'll be focused on efficiency metrics, and I think you're also going to be focused on absolute emission reductions. I think we will see GWP star get adopted, which is good. And I believe at the end part of that 2 years, social equity reporting will also be mandatory for sizable producer groups. In 2 to 3 years, I think we will see the development of a carbon market. I think it's going to develop as an inset market because I think in the animal ag space, there's the need for that is actually greater, right, for climate mitigation. And I think we're going to see the price of carbon increase substantially and I think we're going to see that in offset and inset markets to actually get enough dollars, right, back down into the producer's hand to actually be able to pay for the changes in practices that will be required to show the reductions that will be expected by those markets. Again, we need producers to be in those rooms, and as a call out to the cattle feeders that are in here, make no mistake, the expectation, in my opinion, the expectation will be that you'll be the vehicle to the cow-calf producer, right? So that's going to be a new kind of space for cattle feeders to play in. And finally, in 3 to 5 years, I think we'll be already implementing practices, and we'll need to be reporting progress to reduce our impact on climate change, but also we'll be confronted with other tough issues, right? This is the issue of the day. It's not the only tough issue that we face in this space of emotion and science. So with that, sorry to end on kind of a low note, but I think I'm more or less on time, and I'd be happy to entertain any questions that you might have. Questions? None. Yeah. 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 I hadn't. That's pretty conservative. But also, I mean, this space, it's probably good caution, honestly, right? This space is a little, it's unpredictable. I mean, that would have to be like a kind of a regulatory mandate. I'm not sure they'll ever be that aggressive. Yeah, but sure. Yeah, I mean, scientifically, sure. It's a good point. Lots at play there. Yeah, I'd feel more confident in an inset market, I guess. Yeah, or maybe I'd be more comfortable with an inset market, right? Especially if you have a long-term partnership with who you're selling that to, right? In a supply chain, might make more sense. But yeah, it's good caution. It's good caution. Good question. Other questions, thoughts? Yes.
Being driven more by, is the movement pulled or pushed? Is it driven by regulatory mandates or by incentives? And to wrap that around, there is your comment regarding the emotional element, which doesn't really care about your incentives. It just like get it done. And to me, all of the brand icons that you showed earlier, those are folks running out ahead and putting a stake in the ground without a clue how they're going to get there, but just that gives them some defensibility against the emotional piece. So since you've been so bold here with 5-year predictions, are we going to be pushed or are we going to be led?
Yeah, that changes weekly. Maybe not weekly, maybe monthly now. I feel like it has slowed just a little bit. The push keeps me up at night, right? And I think we all need to be very cautious of that, right? That's where I start to get real anxious about the lack of solutions that we have from a research perspective, the lack of solutions that we know won't put a producer out of business, right? So we have solutions that reduce methane, but they also reduce animal performance, right? And we cannot do that. We cannot burden our producers with that kind of economic loss. But what worries me with the commitments that are out there and the brands that have made them is greenwashing backlash that we know is going to come. We know it's going to come, right, when they made this commitment 2 years ago and they haven't been able to report any progress, or worst case scenario, the emissions have gone up. And then how does that company respond? And do they respond with a top-down mandate that is, you shall feed this, right? And we're not ready. I'm not ready. I'm not ready to tell you confidently that you can go home and feed this to your cows and have it not result in other unintended consequences that we haven't addressed yet. So I think we all need to be very aware that could happen. That could happen. And I would have told you 6 months ago that that was more probable than I think I believe it is now. I think we will be encouraged. I think there's going to be some sort of incentive that is going to come through this, but figuring it out is really hard. These carbon markets are really hard. We've been working with a number of market creators, well, one in particular, and talking about limiting transaction costs of verifying the carbon, right? Like actually on the ground through audits and it's really hard to do. And they're actually considering, like, okay, what can we learn from cryptocurrency and so there's lots of things that are in development now and that we're not, that we need more confidence in to kind of get moving before we can really start thinking about some of what could be on the horizon. But I do feel right now that we if we're bold and we work across both sides of the aisle and we talk about science, but we acknowledge the emotional aspect of this and how hard it all is, we might get to a spot where we can work together to build some incentives into this deal and drive change a different way. Yeah. Yeah, Bill. We have a question here. Oh, sure.
Kim, do you think that instead of the 15 or 500 different types of standards we have, they'll just adopt an ISO climate standard?
I don't know what the SEC is going to do. I think it's going to depend on if that rule gets pushed through, right? And yeah, I do think the SEC will go something real standard like that, right? But they're gonna have to play nice with the IPCC because of the other exchanges that exist in across the globe, and I don't know how well informed they are from a scientific perspective either, right? But I also appreciate their perspective because I've been in those shoes, and it really is an alphabet soup, and it's a nightmare. That's going to be really interesting to watch. And I'm unfortunately not that close to that particular initiative. I wish I was closer. I find a lot of interest in it, but I would imagine so, yeah. Yeah. Other questions? Good questions. Yes?
Do you think there'll be a reset because the current economic situation in the world, the last 10, 20 years has been easy to say, hey, I'm green, I'm going to be green. From an ESG standpoint, I look at my retirement account, and the good companies are down 15%, and the bad companies are up 15%. There's a 30% difference on returns. I'm going to say, hey, show me where I'm going to have a good retirement account. And then if you go to California and gas is $6 to $7 a gallon, and the reason for that is the offsets that they're paying to the dairy farmers for digesters. And if you go to Europe, they shut their nuclear plants down in Germany, but they're having to buy nuclear power from France. So don't you see a huge reset happening right now?
I don't know. This is the kind of thing that keeps me up at night, right? So, yeah, I've been asked that question multiple times too, and I still don't have a real good answer because the markets are such a freaking disaster at the moment with Ukraine and everything else. It doesn't seem to be slowing it down, even though it should be, right? It should be, and it's a really interesting social question as well. So there's a in the sustainability space. It's one of the reasons I love this space is the sustainability professionals are they're really empathetic people, especially towards food security and hunger and other social aspects. Like in corporate sustainability programs, you're always worried about, where labor might be coming from, and other kind of social things. And so in the corporate sustainability space right now, there's a lot of questions happening in this space of who takes on the burden of the elite going green, and how that affects the poorest people across the globe. And make no mistake, it impacts them negatively, and it's terrible, and it's repeatable in history, right? If you look back, it doesn't in my seat, it doesn't feel like it's slowing down. But I'm also in an academic seat now, right? I'm not in my old JBS seat, so I'm not as close to it. But in the academic seat, and the pressure we have from stakeholders, and the questions we're getting all the time, and the help we're getting asked for, it doesn't feel like it's slowing down. It's really interesting. And the corporate sustainability professionals, and that we like everybody, we have our own little blogging groups and things we check on. There's a lot of concern in the space around the social implications of it. Yeah, it's hard, really hard stuff. Good question. Yeah.
I don't know how much of a reading you've got on this so far, but the SEC proposal is basically asking for the sun, the moon, and the stars in a couple of years. What kind of reaction are you seeing, and what kind of political chance does that really have in the near term?
Like I said earlier, I'm not that close to it, and I wish I was closer because I think this stuff is fascinating. Most big companies are reporting already Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3. And they're required to through the Carbon Disclosure Program. Now, the I don't know how to say this without the difference between the requirements of the standards bodies that they're using and how EPA or academia or, quite frankly, industry would report those same greenhouse gas emissions. There's huge variability in the numbers, like sometimes up to 50 to 60% difference, like huge variability in the standards that are being reported today. So companies can do it. How accurate those emissions are become the question, right? And if you're actually then going to be reporting, you're going to be, and they are, the SEC is asking to report that annual progress, right? And that's the problem. And the way this is reported today, it's, there's just not a lot of granularity in the data. And so as such, the data is highly variable because of the huge error that exists there, right? And if you look at like EPA data, for example, or academic data, it's much tighter. You won't see as much error because it's more repeatable over and over and over again, right? And these standards, aren't as repeatable because like, for example, if you're a food company, let's say, or even we'll go back to being a beef company, right? And the market changes, and you kill 1,000 head less, like all of a sudden your scope 3 emissions drop by enteric emissions for 1,000 head. I mean, just happens, boom, like that, right? And we're talking about a meat company, which is, just because we are, but it could happen to a cattle feeder, it could a drought, right? Could like a drought or a wet year or a rebuild year, or the market's telling you to grow the herd, like all that stuff impacts that particular company's reporting. And so the variability in it is significant and hard. Really hard to quantify. Another great question. Good job. This group is good. Yes.
Kim, I have a question. Where do you see the financial incentives? Go back to that piece for just a little bit.
Yeah.
And I asked this from the banking side of the sector.
Yeah.
And how fast are you seeing the banks then go to their producers and either reward and or punish? And I saw your slide there that had the loans. Where are those coming from at the moment?
Yeah, so great question. Banks that are based in Europe are under the most significant pressure, right, because of the regulatory climate over there. So this was back in September, I think, of last year, and I'm probably going to, I had it as a slide for a while, but then it sort of became irrelevant because it was from September. But there was some regulatory kind of noise over there that banks would be regulated against investing in animal agriculture because of animal agriculture's impact on climate. And when that hit, like, my phone exploded because, everybody is, dependent upon loans to do their work. And so I think that it's going to be pretty country specific. Europe is, as you well know, very aggressive in this space. And so we're seeing those banks respond first. And I think, they're doing so because of their board members and, the pressure that they're feeling. The banks are feeling a lot of the same pressure, which is, you are funding, a significant climate risk in these businesses. And so there's a variety, I work with a number of banks. They're great people. And I think they really do a good job. They really care. They're fun to work with. But every bank is kind of at a different kind of point in their journey. Some are further along and are issuing, green bonds and other things in partnership with companies that they've partnered for a long time with. And others are watching the landscape and trying to figure out how to help, right? So we're partnering with a number of them who are, hey, if you need matching funds to go get research dollars, or hey, if we'll help fund this piece of equipment, and so they're just starting to kind of dip their toe in. What does it look like to contribute? So it's a pretty big range of approaches today, just based on what that bank is feeling, but watching it, I think, very closely, just like their, major customers are watching it. Yeah. Hi, Marty.
Hey, Kim. Quick question. And you have done a really nice job, I feel like, in presenting a broad perspective of sustainability and what we're up against as an industry. As we're waiting for the research to catch up, as we're waiting for some of these policies and regulations to come into clearer vision, some of the things you've talked about are pretty scary, and I've found that action binds anxiety. So what would you suggest that we as an agriculture industry can be doing in the meantime to set ourselves up for success?
Yeah, great question, Marty. And, efficiency is still the number one driver we've got, right? And yes, we're going to be expected to produce more with less and reduce our absolute emissions, but efficiency is still our biggest friend. We've just got to keep going down that path. We have to continue healthier animals, give us more milk, give us more meat, eat less feed, like all the things. That's another really fun thing about sustainability, is it's really animal production just viewed through a different lens. But those things are still what we have to be focused on the most. And then I would just let, this social aspect of sustainability can't be forgotten either, right? A focus on people, a focus on welfare. Those things are really important. And the other thing I would ask for everybody to do is engage, right? So if this comes up at anywhere, just engage, get involved. On these carbon markets, we're going to need help. We're going to need people to lend a hand and be willing to talk about your operations. And then if you have a good idea, please pick up the phone, because we're doing a lot of research, and it's easy. Even with the company we had in this morning, they were like, hey, we're doing some precision animal technology stuff with behavior. Would you mind if we put some pedometers on the grazing cows to try to understand, like, what if how long they're ruminating affects methane emissions? Can we put pedometers on them? Sure, by all means, come put pedometers on whatever you want. So those kinds of things, as you guys are thinking about this, you have much more knowledge of your systems than we do. So the more minds, the better. And efficiency for now. Yeah.
Kim, one more question, and kind of piggybacking off of that. As producers, what can we do to partner up with AgNext to help you fill in the gap on the data you're missing and maybe expedite the process?
Yeah, great question. We are currently hiring people, so hopefully my answer will be, what kind of producer are you? I will hook you up with our expert in dairy or feed yards or cow-calf or, for now, come talk to myself or my head of communications and everything else. Everybody's usually surprised. There are 2 professional staff members that work for AgNext, me and JR. She's right up here in front. And we have incredible graduate students, and then there's a number of faculty in here, actually, that partner with us on a variety of things. But for now, just please come give your information to myself or JR, and we'll add, we have a listserv. We try to get, I think we're up to getting maybe every other month quarterly newsletters out, or every other monthly newsletters. So we'd love to put you on that, and then any access to data would be huge. Actually, 2 of the scientists that we're hiring, or we're looking at as final candidates for the dairy and feed yard positions, are both data scientists, so big data type scientists. So we could add that capacity soon too, depending upon how those finalists shake out. Yeah. All right.
Well, Kim, I'll ask
Thank
the
you.
last
one
more, and then we'll let everybody go out in the hall. What do you see is next for AgNext? What's the next big phase? What's the next thing?
Yeah, the hires. So we'll be onboarding 3 new faculty members, hopefully in the fall. So the livestock economists, the dairy systems, and the feed yard systems professors, and that's really exciting. We're really excited about adding those team members to CSU and to AgNext, and then to continue. I think what we're excited with, we've research started under my group that's been largely informed by stakeholders, and I'm excited to see what could happen. Two of those positions, the feed yard and the dairy positions, are 50% of their time is dedicated to engagement. And so the point of having 50% of time of two people dedicated to engagement, and most of the AgNext hires will be like that, is that their research and their teaching and their engagement is sort of it's a big feedback loop of engagement with industry stakeholders and partners, and ideating and executing and ideating and executing, and training people that you guys want to hire, and trying to develop this culture of collaboration and constant feedback and constant connection. And I'm excited for AgNext, and that's what we do. That's what AgNext was designed to do. And it wasn't my idea. It was other people's idea at CSU to develop a group who function like that. But I'm not just excited about our group. I'm excited about, we were at lunch the other day with a candidate and a great scientist who's 70% teaching and 30% research told the candidate how excited he was to have a person who would be working with industry so that he could tailor his research and teaching to what that individual was hearing too, right? So he doesn't have any kind of appointment to really engage, right? He's teaching, I don't even know, 5, 6, I don't know, too many classes, a lot of classes. And so that the time isn't there. So how that shapes as we, work down this path of new collaboration is what I'm most excited about. Awesome. Okay. Thank you so much for your time.